Imagine inheriting everything: the estate, the accounts, the name, the legacy, generations of accumulated wealth passed to you like a torch, and you look at it and you quietly set it down. Not because you're ungrateful, not because you're reckless, but because something about carrying it feels, in a way you can barely articulate, like a kind of death. This is not a rare story. It is not a dramatic one in most cases. It happens quietly in private conversations between attorneys and adult children who surprise everyone, in the lives of heirs who choose small apartments over estates, in the careers of people who could have lived on inheritance but chose instead to work, not for money, but for the right to call something theirs. Today we're going to go inside that psychology. We're going to look at the real, documented, deeply human reasons why some of the people with the most to inherit choose, in whole or in part, to walk away. And I promise you, whatever your relationship with money, this story is about something that touches all of us. Welcome back. If you watched our last video on the quiet signs of old money, you know that we don't do surface level here. Today's topic is one that I find genuinely fascinating because it sits at the intersection of psychology, sociology, philosophy, and family dynamics. It is also one of the least discussed aspects of generational wealth because the people it concerns, by temperament and by training, almost never talk about it publicly. We're going to draw on research in psychology, documented case studies, the writings of heirs themselves, and the broader sociology of wealth and identity. Let's begin. The phenomenon is more common than you think. Before we get into the why, let's establish the what, because many people assume that rejecting inherited wealth is vanishingly rare. It isn't. Studies on high net worth wealth transfer consistently reveal a striking pattern of what researchers call inheritance ambivalence, a spectrum of discomfort, resistance, and in some cases outright refusal that affects a significant portion of heirs from wealthy families. A landmark study by Boston College's Center on Wealth and Philanthropy, which surveyed individuals with assets exceeding $25 million, found that a substantial number of heirs reported complex negative emotions about their wealth, including guilt, purposelessness, and a sense of identity confusion. The study's most quoted finding is both simple and startling. Many of these respondents said that wealth, far from solving their psychological problems, had created or deepened them. Sociologist Robert Kenney, who co-authored research at Harvard Medical School on the children of the wealthy, coined the phrase golden handcuffs syndrome, the phenomenon of inheritors who feel simultaneously unable to refuse their wealth and deeply damaged by it. They can't let go because the practical infrastructure of their life is built on it. But they can't fully embrace it either, because doing so feels like surrendering the last private territory of selfhood. The rejections take many forms. Some heirs give away significant portions of their inheritance to philanthropy or activist causes. Some live deliberately below their means, working ordinary jobs, renting modest apartments, concealing their wealth from friends and partners. Some delay the receipt of trusts indefinitely. Some have formal legal documents drawn up to redirect assets. Some simply disappear from the family orbit. The number of ultra-wealthy Americans who have signed Warren Buffett and Bill Gates's Giving Pledge, a commitment to donate the majority of their fortune, now exceeds 240 individuals. Many of their children have spoken publicly about complicated feelings around what remains. And that's just the public layer. The private layer, the heirs who never make headlines, is far larger. The identity problem. Who are you without the money? The deepest and most consistent reason that old money heirs reject wealth is one that takes time to fully appreciate. Wealth, when it precedes identity, makes identity impossible to construct. Let me explain what I mean by that. For most people, identity is built through struggle. You figure out what you're good at by trying things and failing. You learn your values by being forced to make hard choices. You develop confidence by working for something and achieving it. The process of becoming someone is inseparable from the process of earning your place. Not necessarily in a financial sense, but in the deeper sense of having faced the world and survived it on your terms. Now imagine that none of those conditions apply to you. You grew up knowing that your material survival was guaranteed. The question, "What will I do to support myself?" which focuses and sharpens the identity formation of most young adults, was never your question. You could pursue anything or nothing. You could fail without consequence. You could succeed without pride, because success in a world with a safety net means something categorically different than success without one. This creates what psychologists call identity diffusion, a failure to develop a stable, coherent sense of self. It's the same phenomenon that Erik Erikson identified in his famous stages of psychosocial development. Without genuine conflict, genuine resolution is impossible. Without the crucible, there is no steel. Jessie O'Neill, a psychotherapist and herself a granddaughter of Charles Irwin Wilson, the former president of General Motors and U.S. Secretary of Defense, wrote about this at length in her 1997 book, The Golden Ghetto: The Psychology of Affluence. Her term, affluenza, described the full constellation of psychological symptoms she observed in her wealthy clients and recognized in herself: chronic boredom, a sense of meaninglessness, low frustration tolerance, inability to delay gratification, and a deep confusion about personal identity. She was not describing spoiled people. She was describing people who had never been given the chance to be anything other than wealthy, and who, as adults, found that this left them with a kind of hollowness at the center. For these heirs, rejecting the wealth, or living as though it doesn't exist, is an attempt to retroactively construct the struggle that builds identity. It is psychologically desperate, and it is also psychologically coherent. The guilt architecture, how it builds over generations. There is another layer that is less about psychology and more about moral philosophy, and it operates at a generational level. Old money, by definition, is old, and the older the money, the more likely it is that its origins are complicated. We are living in an era of unprecedented historical reckoning, with colonialism, with slavery, with land seizure, with labor exploitation, with the precise mechanisms by which vast fortunes were originally assembled in the 18th and 19th centuries. For many heirs of genuinely old fortunes, the research they do into their family's history, sometimes in school, sometimes in young adulthood, sometimes through journalism or academic work, confronts them with uncomfortable truths. A plantation, a factory where workers were maimed without compensation, land that was taken, resources that were extracted from communities that were never paid. The philosopher and political theorist John Rawls, in his landmark work A Theory of Justice, argued that just distributions cannot be built on unjust foundations, that the legitimacy of what you hold depends in part on how it was originally acquired. Many heirs, whether or not they've read Rawls, arrive at a version of this intuition organically. Patricia Gualinga an indigenous rights activist from Ecuador, has spoken about this in interviews. Gloria Vanderbilt's son, Anderson Cooper, heir to one of America's most famous old money fortunes, has spoken publicly and repeatedly about his decision not to leave his children a significant inheritance, saying he believes it's a curse to children to give them a trust fund. These are not private moments. They are people working out, in public, a moral problem that many more are working out in private. The guilt isn't only historical, it's also comparative. An heir who grows up knowing that they will never want for anything while their peers struggle with student loans, job insecurity, and housing costs faces a daily cognitive dissonance that is genuinely difficult to manage. The rational response, "I didn't choose this," is psychologically true but emotionally insufficient. Many heirs report feeling a form of what psychologists call survivor's guilt, not survival of a disaster, but survival of a system that disadvantages most while advantaging a few. For some, giving the money away is not idealism, it is relief. The family system, wealth as control. Now we arrive at perhaps the most intimate and least publicly acknowledged dimension of this phenomenon: the degree to which inherited wealth functions within family systems as a mechanism of control. Money is power. This is not cynical, it is structural. And in old money families, the distribution of wealth across generations is rarely a neutral act. It is laden with expectation, with condition, with the unspoken demand that the recipient continue to represent the family in a manner the family considers appropriate. This can be explicit, trusts with behavioral conditions, stipends contingent on career choices, inheritances that vest only upon marriage to an approved partner. But more often, it is implicit. It is the weight of the surname, the expectation that you'll maintain the estate, the assumption that your political views will align with the family's, the pressure to produce heirs, the sense that your individuality, if it deviates too far, will cost you, not in a legal sense, but in the devastating currency of familial disapproval. Family therapists who specialize in high net worth families, including Dr. James Grubman, author of Strangers in Paradise, a landmark text on wealth and family psychology, describe this dynamic in clinical terms. Wealth becomes the invisible governance system of the family. It determines who has voice, who has power, who is central, and who is peripheral. Those who inherit more speak more loudly at family gatherings. Those who are excluded from trusts are, in a very real sense, excluded from the family's inner architecture. For heirs who are, by temperament or conviction, unable or unwilling to perform the role the family has assigned them. The gay child in a conservative dynasty, the artist child in a business family, the political radical in a traditionally conservative lineage. Rejecting the wealth can be the only way to reject the role without an endless negotiation. There are documented cases. Patrick Huber, a researcher studying American aristocracy, has cataloged multiple instances of Gilded Age and post-Gilded Age heirs who effectively exiled themselves from family wealth in order to live authentically. Gloria Vanderbilt herself, who grew up in a custody battle over her inheritance and was surrounded by adults who valued her primarily as a financial asset, spent much of her adult life in creative and financial independence, famously building her own career despite the fortune attached to her name. The rejection of wealth is, in these cases, inseparable from the rejection of a script. The money and the role come as a package. Some people can only refuse one by refusing both. The philosophical heir, voluntary poverty. As ideology, this phenomenon is not new. In fact, some of the most influential intellectual and spiritual traditions in human history were shaped by people of privilege who deliberately renounced it. The most dramatic example is one you almost certainly know. Siddhartha Gautama, born a prince in what is now Nepal in the 5th century BCE. His renunciation of royal wealth and comfort, his decision to walk out of a palace and into the world as it actually was, is the founding act of one of the world's great religions. Whatever your spiritual orientation, the psychological structure of that story is worth examining. A young man of immense privilege encounters suffering, recognizes that his wealth insulates him from reality rather than connecting him to it, and chooses reality. Closer to the modern era, Leo Tolstoy, one of the greatest writers who ever lived, and a Russian aristocrat by birth, spent the second half of his life in a state of increasing anguish about his wealth. He gave away the copyright to his later works. He dressed as a peasant. He tilled his own fields. His wife Sophia was driven to the edge of sanity by his repeated attempts to redistribute the family's assets. He died famously by walking out of his estate at the age of 82, unable to reconcile his moral convictions with his material circumstances, and collapsed at a provincial railway station. In the 20th century, Friedrich Wittgenstein, one of the most important philosophers of the modern era, inherited a vast fortune from his father, a dominant figure in Austria's steel industry, and gave virtually all of it away. He distributed his share of the Wittgenstein family estate to his siblings, and spent much of his life in conditions of deliberate austerity. He worked as a schoolteacher in rural Austria. He designed a starkly minimal house for his sister, now considered a masterpiece of architectural philosophy, and ultimately lectured at Cambridge in a bare room with a deck chair and a camp bed. Those who knew him said he was among the most psychologically intense people they had ever encountered, and that his rejection of wealth was not performance, but necessity. More recently, Abigail Disney, granddaughter of Roy Disney and grandniece of Walt, became one of the most outspoken critics of extreme wealth inequality, using her platform specifically because of her inherited position. She has spoken candidly about the psychological complexity of her wealth, about using it as a tool for social criticism, and about the way that growing up in the Disney family came with an entire architecture of expectation and image management. What connects Siddhartha, Tolstoy, Wittgenstein, and Abigail Disney across the centuries? In each case, the wealth was experienced not as freedom, but as constraint, a wall between the self and reality, between the self and authentic relationship, between the self and a sense of meaning that could not be purchased. What the research says: the happiness. Paradox psychology has been catching up to what philosophers and spiritual traditions intuited for millennia. Beyond a certain threshold, wealth does not produce well-being, and in some specific conditions, it actively undermines it. The research of Nobel Prize-winning psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Angus Deaton, published in 2010, famously found that day-to-day emotional well-being stopped increasing meaningfully above an annual income of around $75,000, a finding that generated enormous discussion and has been refined and debated since, with more recent work by economist Matthew Killingsworth suggesting the relationship continues somewhat higher. But crucially, none of this research suggests that the kind of wealth we're discussing today, generational, inherited, structurally vast, produces proportional increases in life satisfaction or daily happiness. What does produce well-being, the research consistently finds, is a set of conditions that great inherited wealth can actually undermine autonomy, competence, and relatedness. Autonomy means the sense that your choices are genuinely your own. Inherited wealth, as we've discussed, comes with an invisible governance system that compromises exactly this. Competence means the felt sense that you are good at something, that you have developed a skill through effort. When your outcomes are decoupled from your effort, when you succeed regardless of what you do, the psychological reward of competence is hollowed out. Relatedness means genuine connection with others. Connection based on mutual vulnerability, shared struggle, authentic interest. Inherited wealth makes this enormously complicated because it creates a question that never fully goes away. Do they like me, or do they like what I have? This question, which every heir of significant wealth has faced, is corrosive to intimacy in ways that are difficult to overstate. For many heirs, rejecting the wealth is, at some level, an attempt to recover these three conditions: to own their choices, to earn their competence, to be known and loved without the mediating noise of money. The modern wave, heirs who organize. There is something new happening in this generation that deserves attention: the emergence of organized movements among heirs who reject their wealth. Not alone, not in silence, but collectively and publicly. Resource Generation, founded in 1999 in the United States, is an organization explicitly for young people from wealthy backgrounds who are committed to redistributing their wealth and using their privilege in service of social justice movements. Its membership runs into the thousands. Patriotic Millionaires is another U.S. organization of high-income and high-net-worth individuals who publicly advocate for higher taxes on themselves and others in their bracket. A position that is, by any conventional analysis, financially irrational and therefore tells us something important about motivation. In the United Kingdom, organizations like Richer Lives pursue similar aims. In Germany, the Netzwerk Vermögende für eine gerechte Gesellschaft, Network of the Wealthy for a Just Society, has attracted members from some of Germany's most prominent industrial families. What is striking about these movements is not just their politics, but their psychology. They represent heirs who have found community in the rejection, who have discovered that the isolation and ambivalence of inherited wealth, so long carried in private, is in fact widely shared, and who have decided that shared action is better than private suffering. They are, in a real sense, building the identity through struggle that wealth denied them. They chose the struggle. They made it theirs. The real question. Here is what I want to leave you with. The heirs who reject wealth are not, or not primarily, making a statement about money. They are making a statement about meaning, about what a life has to feel like from the inside to be worth living, about whether comfort purchased at the cost of identity is actually comfort, or just numbness with better furniture. And the uncomfortable mirror this holds up is not only for the wealthy. We live in a culture that has, in many ways, universalized the dream of the inheritance. Not in the old money sense, but in the sense of ease. We want the passive income. We want the financial freedom. We want to be, in the language of our era, set. But the research and the stories and the centuries of testimony from people who actually got there suggest something quietly devastating. That ease, when it becomes total, becomes its own kind of trap. That the self that is never tested never fully forms. That the life with nothing left to want is not the life we imagined when we were wanting. The heirs who walk away aren't crazy. They're not ungrateful. They're not performing. They are telling us something that is very hard to hear from where most of us are standing, that having everything can feel, from the inside, like having nothing, and that the decision to want something, to build something, to struggle for something, even when you don't have to, might be the most human decision of all. This is one of those topics that doesn't end when the video does. I'd love to know what you think, whether you find this perspective compelling, whether it challenges anything, whether you've seen this in your own orbit. Leave it in the comments. And if this made you think, share it with someone it would make think too. See you in the next one.